Welcome to Millennials Meet Liberty, your source for sharing hot libertarian takes on the world's weekly headlines. Here's your host, Colt Thompson.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode number 27 of Millennials Meet Liberty podcast with yours truly, Colt Thompson, back on the horse again, rip-raring, ready to go. Happy to present to you guys another half hour worth of goodies in terms of headlines and the libertarian, conservatarian view on these things. Got a few things on my mind today. I'm going to bop around as usual. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Give you guys the most important material out there, in my view, stuff that's pertinent to what's going on in society and culture. So I'm going to jump right into it. A few things that have hit my mind this week are, of course, political. And some of them have to do with taxation. Others have to do with President's Day in the wake of this holiday this past Monday. But I'm going to take a minute to recognize the fact that just today announced on CNN and other news outlets, indeed, CNN is going to be bringing on and hiring Andrew Yang, the disenfranchised previous candidates for the Democratic nod to be president of the United States. So Andrew Yang, the token Asian on stage, well, I guess if you consider Elizabeth Warren some sort of Native American or perhaps Asian, I guess there was two of them up there. But in reality, the token Asian on stage, Andrew Yang's claim to fame was putting forth the idea of the UBI, the Universal Basic Income of $12,000 per year, essentially $1,000 per month, if he were to be elected into the Oval Office. And of course, he dismantled his campaign, fired everyone, and called it quits. And now CNN is turning around and hiring him. And I think this is pretty interesting. Andrew Yang actually, to me, was one of the more articulate and intelligent candidates gracing the fumbling buffoons on stage during the Democratic debates. And I think he had a lot of good points, and I think he understood why Donald Trump was the incumbent and why he was elected after all. I think Yang picks up on the American public tapping into their anger and outrage of displaced jobs, and I think he has a decent pulse as to the angst and animosity the general public feels towards government and how government has let them down over the past few decades. That being said, from a policy standpoint, everything he says essentially defies economics. Very weird considering the gentleman himself is intelligent, articulate, and was raised by two, I believe, PhD parents, or at least one. So, it should come as no surprise that CNN, a Democratic or liberal news network who denounces everything that Donald Trump espouses, it should come as no surprise that Andrew Yang finds himself on the payroll there now. I think they were limited in the amount of Asians they had that were big names at CNN, so perhaps they were checking a box on their EEO quota there, but ultimately they are a network geared towards leftism and big government and all the things born out of that. So getting Andrew Yang is a natural fit, and I think he will contribute a great deal to their message, which is essentially anti-American and anti-free markets. And he will be another more articulate, perhaps sneaky adversary of Donald Trump on the airwaves there for CNN. So congratulations, Andrew Yang, for promising free things, and in turn, garnering enough attention to have CNN turn around and hire you as a political correspondent. I think you are going to do a great disservice to the nation, whether you know it or not. But again, congratulations on claiming that spotlight. And I want to move forward now instead of perpetuating the idea that Andrew Yang should be talked about more than 3 minutes. I guess shifting gears here for a second, I mentioned how Andrew Yang and CNN, they despise a lot of what Donald Trump stands for and what he sets out to do. I mean, just look at the likes of Don Lemon and his whole charade and talking about how people are white supremacists, and people like Van Jones echoing a lot of these stupid, nonsensical statements. Well, let's talk about the Trumpster himself. So all of a sudden you look around and you see over the past couple of primaries, the initial primaries, no one's really talking about what the Donald is up to because, of course, he's an incumbent and there's no one really railing against him in the Republican Party of any merit or anything along those terms. Everyone's coalescing around Donald Trump for the most part in the GOP to continue this, in phantom quotes, incredible economy the world has never seen. So Trump's Mr. Popular. But what has occurred in these primaries is that Trump is completely demolishing the Democrats in terms of turnout and actual votes casted for him. So he's smashing records, not just this year, beating the Democrats at their own game here when they're vying to take him down, but he's just smashing records in general. I mean, he's knocking out the previous incumbents like Obama and Bush in droves. I think he's by tens of thousands of people. I mean, the population has not increased that much in the past few years, and the amount of eligible voters has not upticked that much. And the amount of people who are interested in politics, you would think, has not upticked that much. But all of a sudden, Donald Trump is drawing all of these popularity contests up, and he's winning all of them. I can't really say I know why that is, but I think a big part of it is the impeachment proceedings that ultimately backfired in the faces of Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and the quote-unquote do-nothing Democrats. I think the impeachment and the shit show and the obvious outcome of the impeachment and Adam Schiff wasting his time has predictably backfired on the Democrats. It has energized the base of the Republican Party to stand by their guy and really continue to make America great again, or as Donald Trump's campaignsters like to say now, CAG, keep America great. So Trump is sneakily just having people show up to the voting booths in droves, which really isn't much at all anyway, considering the fact that Americans don't really vote in primaries or vote in general, but the numbers are quite staggering compared to his predecessors who were incumbents. So this looks really good for the red wave and the red tide here as election season has sprung upon us. Who knows if he can generate and maintain any more of this momentum, but we shall see. I think if the impeachment proceedings do not wear off that much, we should see the red sea continue to coalesce around Donald Trump. If another scandal breaks out, I'm sure he is immune or invincible to that. I think the only suspect thing we need to watch out for is the fact that the economy is not better, is the fact that people are not doing much better under Trump than they were Obama. In fact, they may be more indebted and worse off. But the only thing that could take a stranglehold on Trump winning the Oval Office versus his probable opponent, Bernie Sanders, is the fact that perhaps the economy could tilt into some sort of downward spiral or recession. But I think that the Trumpster has the economy by the balls in the sense that the Federal Reserve is eating out of his hand and lowering interest rates. And to the extent that they do that, it could prop up the economy onward and upwards in terms of paper gains and stock gains and real estate gains, and the feeling that people are really confident about the economy insofar as it allows him to win the next presidency. What occurs after that or transpires, I don't know. I don't know how long this bubble can go on. I have no idea if voters will wake up to that after the fact, but by all means, it does not matter, as Donald Trump will probably be our next president again come the next election cycle. Moving forward off that, I think I also want to mention really quick that it was pretty funny that Trump himself ended up attending the Daytona 500. So interestingly enough, you could quickly pick up as an astute observation, this was nothing more than a campaign pitch to the American public. It was red meat to the people who worship him and really love Donald Trump, particularly Southerners with mullets, particularly Southerners in states around Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, who are deeply red, who have Donald Trump's back no matter what. I think he wanted to go down there, much like he has with big college football events, and really market himself because, of course, marketing is his thing. It's starting to seep into the presidency, and it is emboldening his appeal to people who are right of center, people who dislike government and who dislike Democrats. And a gathering of rednecks at the Daytona 500 truly gives Donald Trump some good optics in terms of getting reelected, especially when he's out there as the Grand Marshal saying, start your engines, and flying in an Air Force One. There's quite a few colorful antics going on that makes Donald Trump look like the man, or Mr. Patriot, or Mr. Red-Blooded. I love Daytona 500. I love college football, a la vote for me because I will not take away your guns and we will keep America great. So brilliant strategy there. I think it was interesting that he was asked on the raceway by an interviewer, why he showed up all of a sudden. He was quick to point out that he'd been there 4 prior times. Well, I think the reporter was pretty keen on what he was going to respond with. So she said, well, the last time you were here was in 2001. And of course, that was almost 20 years ago. So it was sort of a good point. Trump talked about how it was tremendous, all of the racing, and he just kept using major verbs and all of that to kind of showcase what he thought about racing and the vroom and the rah-de-da-da and all of these things that people get fired up about. And I think he really probably appealed to some of the simpletons who really love him. So again, definitely a good stroke of marketing there by Donald Trump. And I'm going to shift gears here and talk about something else that's on my mind. So spoke about Yang a bit. We're a third of the way through this podcast. Hit Donald Trump, what's going on there in the early primaries. I'd like to pivot again, and I want to talk about taxation here in the United States just for a minute, give an overview, a lay of the land, maybe perhaps some history in light of the fact that I just filed my income taxes just yesterday. So I hate going to pay my dues to the tax man. When I say that, I am self-employed partly. My income was north of $100,000 this year, but I own some rental properties that I do not pay taxes on until the actual tax day comes around for me, whatever day I choose before the deadline in April. And I always dread those days because I have to cut a check. It just so happened to be that I did not owe much as usual over the course of the past few years because indeed I put a lot of maintenance work and upkeep into some of my rental properties. And that really minimized the amount of damage or the amount of money I owed the federal government. But I'd like to mention taxation generally because for libertarians or conservatarian types, taxation is near and dear to our heart in a very poor, ugly way. So people love the idea in the United States of collecting their refund come around January, February, March, April range. And when they do that, they use it sort of as a bonus, or they treat themselves, or they purchase a car, or they pay down some debt, or they typically do something pretty irresponsible. And what families have gotten accustomed to in the United States is that most families in the United States are very poor. They have limited income. They go paycheck to paycheck. They have not much, if anything at all, in savings. And they take this money and they're really fired up because they claimed all of their children or of their pretend children, what they used to do back in the day. And next thing you know, they have their version of a bonus. And again, for the people who have the upper echelon of income in society, this is a real burden, a drag, and something they should be dismayed at because it's ridiculous that people are celebrating getting tax refunds when people who are wealthy are paying more than their fair share of income taxes. So I could go a lot of different ways with this, but I'd like to first start out by mentioning the fact that a lot of tax professionals have no idea what they're doing, and it's truly a shame considering the fact that the tax code and the tax laws are multiple binders stacks high, and getting into the nitty-gritty is very difficult for even the most seasoned professional tax specialist or tax attorney. So I myself know a lot of these things better than most tax attorneys, but I like to get the brand of maybe an H&R Block or a TurboTax or someone behind what I'm doing in the off chance that I'm sued because I fucked something up and the IRS is coming after me. So instead of them shaking me down, they can shake down a giant corporation who has their name on this, and I have peace of mind. But just thinking about taxation in general, I mean, the wealthiest among us in the United States, I don't know exactly what the number is. They pay the lion's shares of taxes in the United States in terms of income taxes. This is what we're talking about, right? And the United States spent a great deal of their history with no income tax whatsoever. I think we spent maybe half of the life of the United States, being upwards of 200 years old, not paying any income taxes at all. I mean, the United States traditionally was opposed to the idea of taxation in general, particularly the income tax. They viewed it as immoral. The founding fathers started a revolution against the British in order to claim their independence to be free of taxation. That was a massive part of it. The Tea Party Revolution, the no tax on tea, the Boston Harbor incident, all of these things that transpired back in the day. I mean, there was a ruthless appeal by that of the colonists, the very intelligent, bright ones, and then the business owners, because there's a lot more small business owners back in the day, to be averse to taxation because of the idea that they were sort of owned. And the idea is this: if you are entitled to your own income, that means you're entitled to your own labor, perhaps you're self-employed. And if someone owns a part of your income, well, effectively, that taxation owning your income is indeed also owning part of your labor, which basically means you're a slave of the state. I mean, these things were very, very keenly picked up on by people who were business owners, who tilled the land, who escaped from Britain in order to start a new life in the western frontier on the other side of the ocean, a land yet discovered, a land that promised independence, an idea where you could practice the religion you wanted to practice, where you could be free to work and trade and barter in terms of what you really wanted to, with no government stranglehold on your possessions or telling you what you ought to do with your money. So this whole idea and this notion, this great American experiment that was born out of this revolution, again, was fought part and parcel, but predominantly about taxation and how immoral and bad it was, and how that the overlords, the governments, the monarchy at the time in Britain did not deserve a nickel from the laborer. They were not serfs or peasants. They were free to exchange in free market capitalism. Whether they knew what that was or not, that's what they were doing. They came and they tried. They came to Plymouth Rock. They thought the idea of socialism made a little bit of sense, found out very quickly it did not. When people hyper-specialized and took their self-interest at heart, it actually created an environment where trade blossomed and people became wealthier. And the United States largely built up a reputation of being free. It was a melting pot. It was a magnet and a catch-all for people all over the world trying to escape large government, escape communism, escape totalitarianism, escape socialism, escape all of these things that hindered their life. Where opportunity was rampant in the United States, where there was safeguards because of the oceans on either side, and where they had the opportunity to purchase land and really harness this land for good, for themselves, for their families, and then ultimately, born out of that was cities and factories and so on and so forth. There was so much going on. And this was because the idea was humans have negative rights, that they are free of anything that could stand in their way, that the non-aggression principle made sense, that the rights that humans had in the United States were from God and they were not from government, and that government could not encroach on their rights. And these are things that the Founding Fathers took very seriously. They were very bright, articulate, intelligent men while they were in their 20s and 30s. That was, like someone who was in their 30s, 40s, or 50s today because of the life expectancy. But many of them were very educated, and they fought a bloody revolution over taxation. So fast forward to where we are right now, and we have these tax rates, which are ridiculous. I mean, had the Founding Fathers thought of a 1 or 2 or a 5% tax back then, they would have been outraged because it was terrible. And at the time, they had hard money, and they had sound money, and they had gold. And they exchanged in some of these things. And to the extent that they did that, they knew that a 1% tax was a real deal because there's no such thing as inflation. At the time, maybe they had some deflation. So deflation, or rather inflation at the time, would be crippling because they knew there was a direct effect on the money supply being fucked with. Whereas today, nobody understands inflation is built into everything and it's presupposed to be okay. So if the Founding Fathers witnessed what was going on presently in the United States with taxation, and they noticed how there was this escalated tax bracket, that you were essentially punished for creating more wealth, which doesn't make any sense economically at all, which I don't agree with the idea of a maximum wage, something Bernie Sanders has flirted with the idea of, even advocated for. The destruction of wealth is the destruction of not only just rich people getting richer, but the people who are employed by them, because a poor person can only be employed by a rich person. So the idea that we need to limit someone's productivity through a regressive income tax, or limit someone's wealth by virtue of some sort of income tax, is only harming poor people who need to find the opportunity through that of which a rich person provides. So the whole thing doesn't make any sense, and the Founding Fathers would be scratching their head today, but they would most of all be furious, wanting to revolt and saying we should take up arms. Because none of this stuff is right, none of it is moral, and it's totally a Pandora's box we cannot really get out of. Because there's 3 ways the federal government can finance anything at all, any public infrastructure project, anything they want to do, any pet program, any entitlement issue, any ensnarement with foreign governments. It's to print, it's to borrow, it's to tax. Well, borrowing, we do that all the time. We exhausted doing all of that through China, through other major countries. Taxing, we've pretty much taxed people up to their eyeballs to the extent that we're taxed right now. People would be outraged if it went up, and even further considering the shitty government services we already get. And then the third and final thing is probably the most abused these days. It's the printing press, because we left the gold standard, we left sound money, and now the printing press is something where we can just have this unmitigated disaster on our hands where we really push up inflation every single year, year over year, because we can just print the amount of money necessary, in air quotes, to accomplish some of these goals the federal government sets out to accomplish. So the people who are suffering are the people dealing with the pernicious aspects of inflation, where the basket of goods that they need for their household or wants for their household continues to go up in price because their purchasing power declines and it diminishes as a result of the extra money floating around in the economy. So it just boggles my mind that we can just have the idea that we need to show up to the tax man and we should be happy that we're paying this price to live in a civilized society. That's bullshit. In fact, we should be slashing taxes down to next to nothing. Had I had the over $30,000 that was stolen from me in the year of 2019, I think I could have purchased a rental property. I probably could have started a business. I probably could have took a few vacations. I probably could have done whatever the fuck I wanted to do with the money, and it would have been better for my own retirement. It would have been better for my own healthcare. It would have been better for my own education. It would have been better for all of the aforementioned things for my family, for my future wife, all of these things. So it is just a shame that we live in a country where taxation, and you show up and you celebrate because you got all of this money back because you claimed all of these dependents and you had this big family and you were broke. And all of a sudden, this is your bonus. This is your payday. You're licking your chops. Well, yeah, that's probably the feeling the federal government wants you to feel if you're a poor person, because they should know that what they're doing to people is wrong and the people shouldn't be taxed as much to begin with. And that's diminishing wealth and prosperity in the United States. So I don't have a very good feeling about tax day. It actually pisses me off. It's not something I fucking lose sleep over, but the day it happens, I pretty much go there with a grim face. I put up with the stupid person at H&R Block, and I kind of scratch my head and wonder what the fuck is going on in this world that people think this is a good day because they get some big refund. They should be appalled that they paid that many taxes to begin with, and their income is siphoned off by the Leviathan that's the federal government. Which brings me to my next point. I mean, withholding of your income to go to the federal government was an idea born out of the idea that Americans just did not want to voluntarily pay their taxes. Nobody was paying their taxes when the IRS was like, you need to pay this amount. There was rampant lying, cheating, whatever, because the government, who was really the thieves at hand, could not get their mitts on these things and do a proper accounting mechanism because people would, maybe they were self-employed and they would hide some of their income, which people do anyway. But ultimately, people were not volunteering their money. It was too desperate to them. They really wanted to cling on to this money and provide for themselves and their family. So in turn, the employers made it easier by saying, look, you big-time employers, while you pay wages to people, how about this? How about you create some of these forms or give people the option to have their taxes withheld? Then when year end comes around, they can get their little refund or their pittance or whatever they get, but at least the government got what they needed. So the idea of withholding was devised by the government to indeed get the money that they sought out that they thought was theirs, which in essence is something they're just stealing from poor people, rich people, whoever. I mean, when you're working for a wage, the tax is not really being stolen from the wage earner per se. It's really being stolen from the employer because the employer is paying that tax. Because otherwise they would have just paid the worker more money. So instead of paying the worker more money in terms of price of labor, that's kind of all compounded together. And they say this whole tax burden here, this is per employee. So they're going to cut that check to the government through the terms of withholding. So the whole thing is fucking stupid. It just punishes the people who are the producers in the United States. And it's really sickening. And then you think back in the 90s, I think it was Bill Clinton who created this rule where the IRS basically had to have the social security numbers of all of the people who were claimed as dependents. And next thing you know, like a year after that law came into effect, all of a sudden, I don't know, like a few million people just disappeared and nobody knew what happened and why they weren't claimed as dependents the following year. It's because people were just creating social security numbers out of thin air. They were listing their pets. They were doing all of these type of things. I mean, this was going on up as early as the 90s. I mean, what do you think's going on today? Of course, people are still lying and bullshitting. That's what they do. I mean, there's just a ratio. I mean, the higher the income you earn, the more the IRS is going to look at you like the great eye of Mordor. That's all they're going to do. And then let's say you make $100,000 and they expect you to pay between 30 and 40% of your taxes. If you're not within that 30 to 40% window, that's when the eye of Mordor starts, really focusing on the ring there, which the ring is kind of like the money they think belongs to them. But I don't know. The whole thing is a shit show and it's just a disgrace. And it's, it brings me to my final point here is I have a little bit of time to talk, which is I'm going to pass over the coronavirus. I feel bad for the people in China right now. I'll save that for another episode. But what I'd like to mention too is President's Day. I mean, a lot of people had Monday off. So the federal government loves bestowing upon the public holidays, which of course pertain to federal government workers, state government workers, a lot of banks, but generally not the private sector because people in the private sector are being productive, working, and capitalism does not sleep. Hence why it provides for all, while the government people kick their feet back and celebrate presidents, many of which who are completely overrated. And that's what I want to talk about. So I'll mention quickly the fact about Abraham Lincoln. I just like to mention this one quick point because people don't get this. They talk about him as this guy who is so forward thinking and egalitarian and really cared about black people and wanted to end slavery. It's not true. I just want to make that point before I get into the next president I'm going to devote most of this episode to. Abraham Lincoln decided to make a deal with the Union that never happened, that slavery could indeed still exist in the South if they just chose to stay part of the Union and not break off and be true Confederates. That's what he did. It's what the history books won't talk to you about. He wasn't as benevolent as people thought. The entire Civil War was not fought because of slavery. Had it been about slavery, the idea that he floated that little promise to the Southerners that they could keep their slaves and everything would be peachy, obviously it was a lot more than that, because that's not what happened. They still fought a bloody Civil War, brother on brother, over that. So I want people to file that away, because history is not exactly what the modern day civics and social studies courses lead you to believe. But I want to finish really quick with the legacy of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who is a liberal idol, someone people really worship, left of center, who to them changed the face of the United States for the better. And in reality, he changed the face of the United States for the worse. So FDR was, I believe, a president who ended up serving 4 terms, maybe 3, but he was the only president who served beyond 2, or at least, he was the last to do so. I think that was outlawed or banished following that. He did a lot of fuckery. The big thing people need to pick up on is that he literally threw Japanese people in internment camps. He literally created slave labor, slave storage of people, some of which I believe passed away, and others got sick or, became malnourished because, of course, they were in concentration camps, which is actually blatantly racist on behalf of the federal government. So people should not back away from that fact. Another thing about FDR is he took advantage of, it backfired. He really created the standard for which he is the forebearer to the likes of President Obama and other people who I render as pretty much socialists. He was the advent of big, huge, monstrous government. I mean, the alphabet soup, all the programs he rolled out, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, Social Security, pretty much anything meddling in the lives of people to this very day, he enacted. I mean, these were massive welfare state programs that were super costly and have diminished liberty and have trapped people into these things. I mean, presently, he was the catalyst for Social Security and Medicare and types of things like we have today, like Obamacare. You cannot, with a straight face, pretend like Obamacare, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, any of these things, you cannot pretend like they're funded. None of them are fully funded. Hell, none of them are even partially funded. They're all bankrupt programs propped up by inflationary policies by the Federal Reserve, allowing money to go in the hands of these people. And it's just a very, very bizarre world we live in, where this pittance of Social Security is celebrated so much. Same with the likes of Medicare, this, elder care insurance for people for their medical ailments when they're past 65. They are terrible programs. They're insolvent. They're bankrupt. Yet people depend on these things. So, of course, they want to vote to have these things maintained and safeguards, which means the government is going to protect and fund them. I mean, they haven't even done that at all. I mean, like I said, strip away the income taxes, the FICA, the Medicare, the Social Security. If someone making north of 100 grand, say 100 flat, is not paying that 30 grand every year, that penalty, that theft, you don't think they could find a way to provide, their own insurance for themselves via a free market and healthcare? Or you don't think they could find a way to provide some retirement for themselves? I mean, if they had $30,000 to punch into retirement every single year, they'd be fucking multimillionaires in the next 10 years. Given a standard operating level of interest in the NASDAQ or S&P 500. So FDR was a catalyst for this idea of Keynesian economics, where we are going to escape recessions by printing money and spending money on make-work programs where the government digs holes and fills them back up. I mean, economists have talked about this. This is not productive. This is counterproductive. This is really papering over the fact that the Federal Reserve is the essence of what's going wrong in the economy these days, and who enable Congress to get away with their screwy laws. So I want to shed some light just on FDR. Like I said, I mean, with the internment camps and the abuses of power and the unconstitutionality of everything that he did, and with the court packing, I mean, this guy's literally worshipped as like a hero on college campuses, and the left literally revels in the idea that he had so much power and how he influenced the United States, and that we need a new deal. People like AOC are calling for that. We need a second Bill of Rights and all of these things, where he, popularized the idea of creating all of these rights that people ought to have, and that they should be mandated and foisted upon the American public, the people who are working, earning money. I mean, I don't get this. I mean, all of these Ponzi schemes that FDR pushed for are things that Bernie Sanders is just tripling down on. And they have no idea that the reasons that people are poor and the reasons that people have to have to income earners, and the reason that people cannot afford mortgages, and the reason that people cannot afford college, and the reason people cannot afford healthcare, and the reason people have to push off getting married late is precisely because of massive government intervention in the economy. I mean, we're essentially operating as a socialist economy, and a lot of this was kickstarted, again, by FDR, this hero, this president whose wife was idolized. I believe Eleanor was her name, who seemed like a great person, and they were this sort of power couple in office, and he had a wheelchair towards the end of his time there because he was diagnosed with polio. I mean, the guy was a full-fledged celebrity, and he really ate away at what made America truly great, which is free market capitalism. That was the talent of the 1800s, the Gilded Age, and up into the early 1900s. And he decided to squander all of that and set the precedent that we were going to become bankrupt as a nation. We were ultimately going to prove that democracy does not work, because democracy follows what's popular, and what's popular is socialism, because it requires no work with the promise of free things, which is not reality, which is genuinely immoral and stupid. So that's what I have today for episode number 27. Give this a like, a follow, a link, a share, fire it off to your buddies, your friends, or family. Let them hear a dose of the reality through a libertarian perspective, and I will see you next week. Much love, y'all.